Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, John Chi. Our guest today is Andrey Doronichev, founder and CEO at OPTIC, an AI-powered drug discovery platform for rapid molecule screening and testing. OPTIC is building a complete agentic AI platform for biopharma, a system that not only generates outputs, but also plans, reasons, and even writes its own code to pursue drug development goals. A veteran of the tech industry, Andrey previously served as head of mobile at YouTube, director of product at Stadia, and director of product for Google AR/VR. He's also a serial entrepreneur, having co-founded multiple ventures across sectors from virtual reality to community building. With a track record of leading groundbreaking products at the intersection of technology and user experience, Andrey now applies his experience to revolutionizing biotech with AI, making this a conversation you won't want to miss. Over the next 4 episodes, Andrey shares how his path took him from post-Soviet Russia to the forefront of AI drug discovery, driven by a love of technology, a bias for action, and a desire to build what matters. He reflects on key moments along the way, from launching a mobile startup in Moscow to scaling YouTube for billions of users, and how those experiences shaped his approach to leadership and innovation. Andrey also talks about the realities of startup life, how his team made a bold pivot into biotech, what it takes to build a platform from scratch, and why conviction and clarity matter most when you're building at the edge. Today, we'll hear about Andrey's childhood in the Soviet Union, the upheaval that followed its collapse, and how growing up amid chaos and scarcity shaped his tolerance for uncertainty and change. He shares stories of waiting in bread lines at 5 a.m., secretly watching smuggled American movies, and discovering computers and programming as both a lifeline and a way out. We also look at how those early experiences sparked his drive to build, revealed a natural talent for math and coding, and led him to choose software over science as his starting point. Without further ado, let's dive into part 1 of our conversation with Andrey Doronichev.
Andrey, so good to see you again. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, John. Hi. Thanks for having me.
I've been really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm glad we finally were able to triangulate the overlap on the calendars. I know you're a busy guy, but as we were doing our homework, we were really looking forward to kind of dive into the earliest days of your adolescence and journey, because we think a lot of those formative years kind of shape one's leadership style and business philosophy that they carry with them to the current day. So if you could take us all the way back, what was young Andrey like? Tell us about that.
That's where my imposter syndrome kicks in, because I have a very different story from many successful life scientists out there. I'm not a life scientist myself. I did not go to a fancy American school. I'm an immigrant, and I actually grew up in Soviet Union. Well, at least like part of my childhood was spent there. It was a weird time and a weird place to grow up in. So I was actually a part of a really smart, science-oriented family, physics and computer science. My parents worked in research organizations and working on like modeling rocket engines and solving all sorts of complicated tasks. And back then, computers were just like in the very beginning of the new era of computational everything. And so they were working at the forefront of back then Soviet computer science. So that certainly influenced a lot who I am and what I work on. But also just the environment where I grew up, I think really screwed my brain in a certain way.
Yeah, as it does, yeah.
Because not that many people have a birthplace in their passport that doesn't exist anymore. So like literally I have USSR as my place of birth, and it's a country that does not exist. And, maybe like actually it's good that it doesn't. But it is a really special thing to go through something as massive of a change as a country disappearing underneath your feet and the world as you know it changing dramatically. And that happened to me when I was 9. Like you live in a certain world, like good or bad, it was set up in certain ways, and it was like this for your parents and their parents. And then suddenly, like everything you knew about the world is found to be wrong, or it doesn't exist anymore. And there's a completely new world coming in and you have to adapt. And my parents were kind of quite successful people, right? Software engineer, my mom, software engineer, leading a team at a research university, having access to computers and like bringing all those punch cards home and working on them in the evening. And suddenly, due to hyperinflation, her salary equals to like $20 a month, right?
Wow.
And suddenly our family is really struggling, and we're not in a sort of some kind of successful kind of, I don't want to use the word elite, but some sort of intellectual circle. We're suddenly like a family struggling to buy food. And I remember times when like they would wake me up at 5 a.m. and I'm like 6, and we would go in the blistering cold to this like corner store to queue up for bread and butter, like literally bread and butter. And they give us this piece of paper with the number of your queue number, and we're like 2,000 something. So it's 5 a.m., the shop will open at 9, and we have to stay out there because if you leave the queue, you lose your place, and you wait for like 4 hours outside in winter in Moscow to buy some butter, literally. So those kind of things, it's a massive change, right?
Yeah, massive.
And I think people who choose entrepreneurship as their profession, as their way of life, they all are a little bit crazy, right? Like, it's like, why would you pick this path? Like, this is a path of uncertainty. And I feel like this like early exposure to dramatic changes is something that it either breaks you and you like really, really avoid dealing with uncertainty, or you actually create some sort of immunity and you're okay with living in a world where everything can change or everything can end any moment, or you might be completely wrong. Like all your beliefs might be found completely wrong overnight. I feel like I got a vaccine early on for that. And so like this dramatic change where you go from like, oh, we're well set up intellectual family with parents at this really good jobs and doing some really smart things. And I will go to school and I will go to university and I will be a scientist. And suddenly like we're struggling to survive. We need to learn how to grow our own potatoes, like quite literally.
Wow.
And we never had any exposure to farming or whatnot. And that was my first early on exposure to biology. It was like, okay, we need to figure out how to grow crops because in winter we need to eat something. And we all go to like this plot of land that my parents got from the government for that reason to grow potatoes. So that we can feed ourselves, right? And we learn how to do this. And it was like quite crazy of a change. So that's one thing. And that's like, I think the exposure to change. And like, I think if I were to boil it down to one word, chaos. Chaos of the fall of Soviet Union and the early days of Russia, they impacted me a lot as a kid. And the second thing is that just like today, Russia was a dictatorship, right? It was a autocracy or whatever, but it wasn't a free country. It was an extremely harsh place with government trying to control everything in all sorts of screwed up ways. And more specifically, what hit me as a kid was that they were controlling access to information. And I just couldn't stand that. I couldn't understand why I can and cannot read some books, not the others. My parents were always like in the circles of intelligentsia who were getting some illegal stuff that for some reason was illegal, like Pasternak's, like Dr. Zhivago was illegal. Right? All sorts of stuff like that. It's like they would get access to those books or those later on films on VHS videotapes, and just owning those things could get our family in trouble and could get us arrested. And I remember that like episode as a kid where I was 7. I loved American movies that were smuggled into Soviet Union. And we had a Rambo tape with Rambo 2 and 3. And apparently it was considered like some sort of extremist material by Soviet government. And I didn't know this, of course. I was like 7-year-old kid, right? So I invited a couple of buddies from my school and we were watching Rambo. And then my mom walks in and I see on her face that she's about to faint. Like she's becoming like super pale, super scared. She like stops the tape and was like, "What have you done? Your friends will tell their parents. They will call KGB on us or police on us. I'm going to jail for this."
Oh,
and
wow.
And observing this is like, you can imagine like Rambo, like, okay, that's a probably age inappropriate movie, but not the one you should go to jail for.
Yeah.
And to me, that was like a really scary, traumatic moment where I like learned that like just accessing information, just watching or reading something can be as dangerous as losing your parent and they could go to jail for it, right? So I think that was another thing that really kind of in a certain way messed with my head. And so as I was reflecting on things that seriously impacted like the way I built my career and where I went, those two things, the uncertainty and chaos unfolding around you that challenges all the beliefs and breaks all the things you are used to. And two is that idea that information is not free, access to information is restricted and actually scary and risky. Those two things, impacted my choices later on in my career.
I can imagine it had a massive impact. And I think what really stood out to me, and something I think about when you feel this kind of like tectonic shift underneath you, when you go from just like, there's like these externalities that are just beyond your control. And then you have a new hand of cards that look completely different. And something about the startup journey or just entrepreneurship that I think that experience builds like resilience. Cause like, you're like, I had to learn agriculture to put food on the table.
That's right.
I went back to the actual bare necessities of survival. What a startup challenge. What is a startup challenge? I'm trying to put food on the table for the family, right? Like
that's right.
That's like right. You understand what like true hardship is. So it kind of contextualizes, not to diminish startup challenges, because startup challenges can be incredibly stressful. There's a lot of on the line. But if you're like, I've gone through and survived something as traumatic as this chaotic kind of uncertainty, you're like, we can get through this. Whatever this is that you're in front of you, we can get through this.
Yeah, this is what was going through my head just recently. I'm sure some of the listeners experienced that too, because it was a shared trauma of many startups. Just a couple of years ago when Silicon Valley Bank went down, right?
God.
And that was the moment where I relived some of those memories from my childhood where, we just raised a round. We have $10 million on our account in a very, very, very respected Silicon Valley bank. And then next morning, I cannot sign in. And I learned that the bank is under. And that it's likely that our account is insured for $250K and the rest of $9,750K are gone.
Insane.
All right. And that feeling, like I was calling like so many friends and like VCs and, most of them had their money there. And the reactions were very different. So like in a way, I felt like I had this resilience built in me where I was like, okay, so how much runway do we have with the rest of the cash? How much of my team I can afford to pay? What do we do? What is the next step for today, for next week, and for this next month to survive, right? So that way of thinking really, really is something that you acquire through those sort of life hardships. And I'm grateful for that.
For sure. And it's not to say like, I want to relive that again. It's not like, it's just like, no,
not recommended. It's like, thank you very much. Great experience. Do not recommend anyone to go through this.
That's exactly like, please, I don't want to, but I'm glad that I had that experience. I can kind of carry forward and, handle it better if it were to come up. But God, please, like, let's not have another one of those moments. So I totally get it. Cause I think, from early days of Exceeder, we had to be incredibly scrappy because like we're not venture backed. So in the earliest days, you had to bring in paying customers. And when you have just one customer in the very beginning, hard to pay a lot of bills. So you kind of have to figure it out, right? And those early years, again, don't want to go back there, but are formative. I was like, okay, this was like shoestring. Like, can I live on this shoestring? And I was like, I proved to myself yes, I can survive on a shoestring. Like I can do it. Like I can do it.
It's liberating in a way, right? Knowing that it's liberating.
It makes you really question, like, what do you actually need as a person?
That's right.
Like, what do you actually need? And then from there, the frame of mind is like, it's only up from here. Like, it's only up. That is liberating in a way.
And I have a huge respect for entrepreneurs who bootstrap their companies. This was my first experience. And as we get to it, I'll tell you the story, how we started the first company. But yeah, it was also like zero investments, just like we put our salaries on the table for a month. And we were like, okay, if this is enough to start the company, we're good. If not, well, we go find another job.
yeah, exactly. That's like most businesses. Honestly, it's like being in the Bay Area, you kind of like, you kind of this distortion field where, it almost makes you think that company can only be formed or financed a certain way. But like most businesses in the world is exactly that. Like you kind of just have to like bring in the dough so you can pay your bills.
Exactly. But this is where you bootstrapping a business in bio field, in life sciences, is dramatically more respectful than me doing the same thing in software. Because one thing I learned from my transition from pure tech to life science tech bio is how much more capital intensive this business is and how different is the power dynamic between entrepreneur and investor. And given that, like, first of all, like what Exeter is doing is a great model, like I believe for ecosystem in general. So thank you for that. But also, like, frankly, I didn't know that you guys bootstrapped, and it is incredibly cool.
Thank you. I did not go in. I thought this was a venture backable business in the early days, by the way. Like, no, like I like at Berkeley, I like went through, it was like the early days when they were just like, Berkeley was just starting to embrace entrepreneurship. Berkeley's before then was like incredibly just like keep startups away from us. We're academic. We're pure academics. And then so I was like going through, I was like learning about it. And I was like, I think this could be a venture backable business. And then they're like, you mean you have to put a crap ton of money into the business continuously? No, like we're gonna bring on the software company. I learned that. So it's not because it was more of like, I just didn't realize and was unable to do it. So I guess I was like, I guess I just have to do it this way. Like I wish that's kind of it was the reality, but yeah, totally.
Well, ignorance is a bliss when it comes to entrepreneurship. And in a way, like this is the same for me, like doing what I'm doing right now. As many entrepreneurs will say, like, if I knew how hard it was, I wouldn't start. Right? Yeah. So in many cases, it's just good to make a leap of faith and start something and then find out that, oh, actually, there is no investment behind it, or, oh, actually, it's super hard.
Yeah, exactly. No one would do anything. We would just like, no company would get started. So now, you've undergone this tectonic shift. As you're growing up, obviously your parents came from academia. What was like the academic system like in a post-Soviet world? Was this kind of a thing where the schools that you would have gone to were no longer there? What was like your kind of education journey, or, how did that shift?
Yeah, so this is another important thing that I think makes me different and in a way like fuels my imposter syndrome. Is that in the 90s in Russia, suddenly like the prestige of academia went dramatically down. It basically, those were poor people suddenly, right? Just like my parents. Cool guys were those who were like selling stuff, starting a retail business. Like suddenly like everything went upside down. People who were considered like elites in the previous way society was set up suddenly became the poorest and the least respected people. And suddenly like, frankly, like, the scum, right? Like in many cases, the mafia, bandits, right? Everyone knows about this like crazy times in like 90s in Russia where the angriest, the most violent, the most illegal people like not respecting the law suddenly became the most powerful and the richest and got the highest status in the society. It was a weird time for a teenager to look at the world because you're trying to understand like where you stand, how you want to be. And I had those two things struggling within me where I realized two things. Like one, I don't want to be poor. I cannot be like this struggling academia professor or whatever who is just like doing things for ideological reasons. And I'm not that person. I'm sorry. Like I need the comforts of life and I need to feel successful. At the same time, I realized that I cannot be successful in the way success is defined in the country where I'm currently living. So it's like, in order to be successful, you have to break law, you have to be like violent or whatever, like you have to be that, you have to be corrupt. Like I cannot do that either. So for me, it was a really like hard struggle, especially as a teenager, where I'm like, I'm not sure what to do. And that's when internet like saved the day. It suddenly gave a third path for me and people like me. I'm sure there are more stories. Like I heard similar kind of stories from people of my age who ended up in tech and ended up successful in tech. Because I got lucky in a way, right? Like I got exposure to computers at the age of 6 or 7 when my mom would take me to work, and I would like sit in front of the terminal screen of like one of those older computers, mainframe terminals. And I remember inventing a game where like in a text editor, I would just move the cursor and I would put random symbols and I would try to hop over them with the cursor. Obviously, like that was a weird game, but
yeah.
I was fascinated by those monitors and computers. And by the age of 7, I actually, again, was lucky enough to get one of those early home computers with a cassette tape for a storage medium. It wasn't ZX Spectrum, as you know, for many people. It was like a more niche computer called Enterprise 128 for 128 bits of RAM. And it had BASIC built in, and you could write a program and run it, and then you could save it on a tape, on a regular like audio recording tape. And so that was the first exposure to programming for me, because my mom taught me how to write BASIC, and because it didn't have any games, she would buy me smuggled magazines with like lines of code written in it, where if you could retype this code into your computer, it might actually run. So that was my first game, was actually a snake that I typed up, like, you know, a couple thousand, I don't remember how many lines of code, but, you know, but a lot of lines of code for a kid to type.
Yeah.
And then as I typed it up, like weeks later, it actually ran and I could play a real game on my computer. And that felt really great because I created it and was alive. And so that first exposure early on to computers and programming was, of course, a blessing, because by the age of 15, as I started high school, I was really good with computers comparing to the vast majority of people around me, good enough to actually make money. So my first job was going into random people's homes or offices and setting up their Windows PCs and setting up their drivers and, you know, just making their computer stuff work. And I could charge $50 per customer as a kid, as a like actually 14-year-old kid. That was my first gig like this. And just for comparison, every teacher in my school who was teaching like 9 to 6 and really smart and really dedicated people were making $200 a month salary, right? So I was making $50 for like several hours of like computer setup work. And that gave me this new path, which is you don't have to be a struggling academia people and work on stuff you love, but be like really unsuccessful. You don't have to be an asshole working on some horrible stuff that you hate, but making a lot of money. There's this path in the middle where you could be working with computers and you paid a lot and there's a lot of opportunity there. And that really set me up on this path. And so that's why, like, for high school, I actually picked one of a very few extremely computer science focused special schools. It was called the Lyceum. Was basically like a charter school, I guess, in our terms, which was set up in a certain way. It had very special like curriculum, way more equipment, computer class, and they were like super serious about math and computer science. And so for me, that was the first, and in fact, like probably the most important step in my education was the school, because it suddenly put me in a group of like-minded kids rather than, you know, your average slice of Muscovite kids at the time who were all as confused as I explained, like, you know, what should we do? Should we be gangsters or what, like, how do we live our life? Into this very isolated group. It's almost like the next time I felt this way was when I joined Google in 2007. It's like isolated group of extremely smart kids who were fascinated by computers. And we all like fed each other's curiosity, and we basically normalized this idea that it's okay to be a nerd.
Yeah.
You have your own like
your
tribe
peers.
of nerds.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
And it actually can be cool being a nerd. So that was like a big shift for me. And so at the end of the school, as I was graduating, just to give you an idea, my end of high school project was like a 3D rendering software that I wrote by hand, like from scratch, right? Like before Windows, it was running on DOS. So which means like I had to like write drivers for the mouse and everything. But there was actually like rendering stuff, shading things.
Whoa, that's crazy.
Yeah. One of the teachers was, for some reason, teaching linear algebra to 8th graders. And like, right. So in the 9th grade, I participated in some science conference for like talented kids where everyone was like at the age of like 17 or 18 presenting some posters. And my poster was about some like weird multiplication of matrices. But, it was something silly and trivial for someone who is like at a college level. But for 9th grader, that was like really weird that I would even like present that. But for me, that meant that by the time I was at 11th grade, I actually could write a shader, right? And I could write a 3D rendering software because linear algebra is pretty important for that. And now for AI, right? So that was great.
Oh my God. That's so intense because I have friends who did math and computer science at Berkeley and were like, damn, linear algebra is hard. This is in college, like, and you're in high school.
Well, if you think it's hard, like for me, that was the fork in the road because simultaneously I was pretty good at math, but simultaneously I found that I was pretty good at chemistry. And I was like sent by the school to like one of those city Olympiads and competing like in chemistry. But that is when it hit me. And I think it like connects back to this idea that I got exposed to like complexity of chaos and like change and, uncertainty early on. Back then, I didn't embrace it and I was afraid of it. And I just realized that, math is where everything becomes simple. At the end, it might be very complex, but once you understand it, it boils down to an equation and it's just that. It may be a very long equation, but it's just that and it's static and it's safe and it will not change and it's certain. So it's kind of deterministic. It's fantastic. When you deal with even chemistry, chemistry is better, but like when it comes to biology, it's the whole next level, right?
Yeah.
But once you get to those subjects where in a textbook, instead of equations, you have pictures drawn with like some stuff flying around, that is when uncertainty and chaos hits you like really, really hard. Because no, you cannot like do a strict mathematical proof of the way the cell works. No, even like for chemical reactions, you're never like truly certain that the reaction that you write down in your textbook will work like that in an actual lab. And so as I was competing for those Olympiads, I realized that I just have a fundamental fear of going beyond equations. So the moment there is no equation, like I feel really lost and scared and I don't want to do this. And so from that moment on, my choice was like, okay, I'm not dealing with physics, unlike my parents. I'm not dealing with chemistry or biology. I'm going to go straight into very clear, very safe space of ones and zeros where I can debug every line. I can, no matter how complex, I can deal with this. I can predict it. It's very, very safe.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, honestly, like I never heard it put that way, but it makes a lot of sense. And you're absolutely right. Like when you try to apply that to like biology, just every day you're just like smacked in the face. You're just like, because you're like, it worked yesterday, but now it's not working today. I did the exact same thing. What the heck is going on?
Now that I talk to bench scientists, like wet lab people, and actually like spend some time myself in wet lab to like try to synthesize things or like run an essay, I have tremendous respect and admiration, resilience of people doing like running actual experiments, right? Because waiting for sometimes for a year for your protein to maybe crystallize just to find out its 3D structure. This is not something I could imagine doing myself ever.
It sounds torturous.
Like that takes some guts, like really. Yeah. So, but I didn't have those guts, and so I bailed. And so you mentioned linear algebra was hard. No, it wasn't. Comparing to like biology, it wasn't hard at all. You just needed to spend a lot of time understanding the first principles, but once you do, then it suddenly like all makes sense.
Yeah. Totally.
That's all for this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast featuring Andrey Doronichev, founder and CEO at OPTIC. Join us next time for part 2 of our 4-part series, where we'll hear how Andrey built one of Russia's first mobile content platforms turning a wild idea into a profitable startup, and discovering what success looks like when you bet on your own vision. He'll also share why he walked away from it all, how a cold email to Google opened new doors, and how those steps set him on a path that eventually led to YouTube. If you're enjoying the podcast, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeder provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exceeder.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeder or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeder or its guests.